I'm afraid this wedding is canceled. There will be no union today.
The feedback from the microphone shrieked through the cathedral, a jagged sound that made 300 elite guests flinch in their pews. Malcolm Kessler didn't just hesitate. He looked at Layla with a cold, corporate detachment that was more lethal than any physical blow. He didn't lower his voice. He wanted the world to hear. "This wedding was a merger I no longer require," Malcolm declared, his voice booming through the speakers. He reached out and snatched the ring back from Layla's trembling hand, the metal scraping her skin. "You were a loyal asset, Layla, but I've found a better investment. The wedding is off." He dropped the microphone with a hollow thud and stepped off the altar as if Layla were nothing more than a piece of discarded luggage. Layla Nwankwo didn't scream. She didn't chase him. She stood frozen in her intricate lace gown, the weight of 1,000 judging eyes pressing the air from her lungs. Tears carved tracks through her makeup as her white roses shook, petals drifting to the floor like snow on a grave. Every phone in the room was raised, capturing her ultimate disgrace for the morning headlines. But then, the heavy oak doors didn't just open. They were held wide by men with the disciplined posture of soldiers. Chairman Kang Jae-hoon moved down the center aisle with a predatory, fluid grace that silenced the whispers in an instant. The dragon of the underworld didn't look at the fleeing groom. His eyes were locked on Layla with an intensity that made the vast cathedral feel small. He reached the altar and stepped into the void Malcolm had left behind, his broad shoulders shielding Layla from the prying lenses of the crowd. He reached out, his gloved fingers tilting her chin up until she was forced to meet his dark, focused gaze. The dragon tattoo on his neck peeked from his collar, a silent promise of the violence he would inflict on anyone who dared to laugh at his expense. "You've spent 5 years organizing my life, Layla," Jae-hoon said, his low baritone vibrating through her soul. "It's time someone organized yours." "Chairman," Layla whispered, a single tear falling onto his black glove. "What are you doing?" Jae-hoon didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her with a terrifying, ancient hunger. He turned his head slightly toward the priest, who sat paralyzed in shock. "The groom has forfeited his position," Jae-hoon declared, his voice ringing with the authority of a king. "And I have never been a man to let a high-value asset go to waste. I am the groom now. Continue the vows." "Hello, family, how are you doing? If your boss offered to marry you and destroy your toxic ex's life in one move, would you say, 'I do,' or walk away? Tell me in the comments, what would you do? Subscribe to this channel if you are new here and also comment the city you are watching from. Now let's dive into the story. The air in the cathedral was thick with the scent of lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of public disgrace. Layla Nwankwo stood at the altar, her breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps as the echo of Malcolm's rejection vibrated through the stone walls. 300 guests sat in a silence so absolute it felt heavy, their gazes like needles against her skin. She was the most efficient secretary in the city, a woman who lived by schedules and contingency plans, yet nothing in her files had prepared her for the moment her life became a viral tragedy. Then came the sound of the oak doors closing, not with a slam, but with a deliberate, heavy thud that commanded the room's attention. Kang Jae-hoon did not rush. He moved down the center aisle with the slow, terrifyingly calm pace of a man who was exactly where he intended to be. The chairman was a title the public knew, but the man Layla had served for 5 years was a mystery she had never quite unraveled. Today, that mystery felt dangerous. His black suit absorbed the morning light, and as he drew closer, the dark ink of the dragon tattoo on the side of his neck seemed to pulse against his collar. Layla watched him through a veil of tears, her mind a chaotic blur. She expected him to be at his office, perhaps reviewing the quarterly reports she had finished just hours before her wedding. Instead, he was here, looking at her with an intensity that made the vacuum of Malcolm's absence feel suddenly, violently filled. As he reached the front, he didn't stop at the pews. He stepped onto the elevated marble of the altar. He moved into the empty space Malcolm had left behind, his broad shoulders effectively blocking Layla from the prying eyes of the congregation. The sheer heat of his presence was an anchor, a physical barrier against the humiliation still pouring from the pews. "Chairman," Layla whispered, her voice a fragile thread, "you shouldn't be here. This is a disaster." Jae-hoon reached out. His hand was steady, his touch light as he brushed a stray, tear-soaked curl from her cheek. "I don't invest in disasters, Layla," he said, his voice a low, melodic baritone that somehow carried to the very back of the church without effort. "I invest in value, and Malcolm Kessler is the biggest fool I have ever had the displeasure of knowing." He turned his head slightly toward the priest. The elderly man was pale, his hands trembling against his prayer book. The entire room held its breath. "The ceremony isn't over," Jae-hoon declared. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an executive order. But the groom," the priest stammered, his eyes darting toward the side door where Malcolm had vanished. "The groom has forfeited his position," Jae-hoon said, his gaze returning to Layla. In that moment, the chairman persona cracked just enough for her to see something she hadn't recognized in 5 years of late-night meetings and morning coffees. It wasn't pity. It was a possessive, ancient hunger that had finally found its moment to strike. "And I have never been a man to let what belongs to me be discarded." He stepped closer, closing the distance until Layla could smell the faint, expensive scent of sandalwood and cold rain that always clung to him. He took her hand, the one Malcolm had nearly bruised when he snatched the ring, and interlaced his fingers with hers. His grip was firm, warm, and absolute. "Continue," Jae-hoon commanded, his voice ringing through the rafters like a bell. "I am the groom now, finish the vows." Layla felt the world tilt. She looked up into the eyes of the man she had called Sir for half a decade, the man whose secrets she guarded and whose coffee she made exactly the way he liked it. She saw the dragon on his neck, the cold steel in his gaze, and the silent promise of a protection so fierce it would burn the world to keep her safe. She had a choice: walk away as the woman the city pitied, or stay and become the woman the underworld feared. She didn't pull her hand away. Instead, she took a shuddering breath and squeezed back. "Proceed, Father," Layla said, her voice finally finding its steel. The priest swallowed hard, looked at the dangerous man standing where a coward had been moments before, and began to read. But as the words of the ceremony filled the air once more, Layla caught a glimpse of Malcolm in the shadows of the vestibule. He had stopped to watch his handiwork, expecting to see her in ruins. Instead, he was staring at the man who had just taken his place. And for the first time in his life, Malcolm Kessler looked truly, deeply terrified. Jae-hoon has secretly loved Layla for 5 years while she was dadding Malcolm. Do you think he was waiting for this wedding to fail, or did he plan this all along? I want to see your theories in the comments. The transition from the sacred, echoing cathedral to the interior of the blacked-out Merced's limousine felt like stepping from one reality into another. The heavy door clicked shut with a vacuum-sealed hiss, instantly severing the sounds of the frantic media outside, the flashing bulbs, the shouted questions, and the spectacle of the year. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of expensive leather, and the sharp, clean scent of the chairman's cologne. Layla sat in the plush rear seat, her voluminous white lace gown overflowing in the confined space like a trapped cloud. Her hands were still shaking, the adrenaline of the altar beginning to ebb, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache of shock. Beside her, Kang Jae-hoon sat with his legs crossed, looking as composed as if he had just finished a routine board meeting instead of claiming his secretary as his wife in front of the city's elite. He didn't speak immediately. He reached into the cherrywood console and pulled out a leather-bound folder. He flicked it open, revealing the crisp, white parchment of a marriage certificate. There, in the dim light of the cabin, the names were already filled in: Kang Jae-hoon and Layla Nwangwo. "The priest signed his portion before we left the vestry," Jae-hoon said, his voice a low, steady baritone that vibrated through the quiet car. He didn't look at her, he was focused on the document. "All that remains is your signature." Layla looked at the pen he offered, a heavy, gold-nibbed fountain pen she had bought for him herself 3 birthdays ago. "Chairman," she whispered, her voice still thin and brittle. "Why did you do it? You didn't have to save me. I could have. I would have survived the embarrassment." Jae-hoon finally turned to her. In the shadows of the limousine, the dragon tattoo on his neck looked almost alive. "Survival is for the weak, Layla. I don't want you to survive. I want you to prevail." He leaned in closer, his presence commanding and singular. "You have spent 5 years anticipating my every need. You have protected my interests, managed my secrets, and stood by my side when men twice your age flinched. You are not a woman who deserves to be a footnote in Malcolm Kessler's story." Layla reached out, her fingers brushing his as she took the pen. The warmth of his skin was a stark contrast to the icy numbness in her chest. She looked at the line where her name was to go. For 5 years, her signature had appeared on memos, flight manifests, and non-disclosure agreements. It had always been the signature of an employee, a ghost in the machinery of his empire. Signing this meant something else entirely. It meant she was no longer the help. She was the partner. She was the shield. And as she caught the glint of the tinted windows reflecting the dark world outside, she realized she was now part of the shadows he moved in. "If I sign this," she said, looking him in the eye, "the professional boundaries are gone. I won't just be your secretary anymore." "You haven't been just my secretary for a long time, Layla," he replied, his gaze dropping to her lips for a fraction of a second before returning to her eyes. "You were the only person in this city I trusted. Now you are the only person I am bound to. There is no going back to the office on Monday to file my taxes." Layla took a breath, the scent of the white roses in her lap mixing with the leather of the car. She thought of Malcolm's sneering face, the way he had tossed her aside like a failed investment. Then she looked at Jae-hoon, the man who had seen her value when she was invisible to everyone else. With a steady hand, she pressed the gold nib to the paper. The ink flowed smooth and black, anchoring her life to his. As she finished the final flourish of her name, Jae-hoon took the folder from her. He closed it with a definitive snap. "Drive," he commanded through the intercom to the partition. The limousine lurched forward, gliding away from the church and toward the heights of the city. Layla leaned back into the seat, the weight of the lace suddenly feeling less like a costume and more like armor. She looked down at her hand, and Jae-hoon reached over, covering her fingers with his. It wasn't a gentle hold, it was a claim. The realization hit her then, sharper than the betrayal. She hadn't just escaped a bad marriage. She had entered a kingdom. And in the world of Kang Jae-hoon, loyalty was the only currency that mattered, and the price of his protection was her entire soul. She wasn't an employee anymore. She was a Kang. And as the city lights blurred past the blacked-out glass, Layla realized the dragon didn't just save his queen, he kept her. The blacked-out limousine glided into the private subterranean entrance of a steel and glass skyscraper that pierced the very heart of the city's skyline. As the car came to a smooth halt, the door was opened from the outside by a man whose presence made the air feel suddenly thin. He was broad-shouldered, dressed in a tactical black suit, with an earpiece glinting like a shard of ice. He didn't look at Layla. He bowed deeply to Jae-hoon, his eyes fixed on the concrete floor. "Welcome home, Chairman," the man said, his voice a low, disciplined rasp. Jae-hoon stepped out first, extending a hand to Layla. As she took it, the heavy silk of her wedding gown rustled against the pavement, a stark, pristine white against the industrial shadows of the garage. Standing nearby were 4 more men, Han Min-seok and Young Tae-won among them, positioned with the lethal precision of sentries. They didn't move, they didn't blink, and they didn't smile. To Layla, they didn't look like executive security. They looked like soldiers in a war she hadn't realized was being fought. They were ushered into a private elevator that required both a biometric scan and a physical key held only by Jae-hoon. The ascent was silent and dizzying. When the doors finally slid open, Layla stepped out into a world that felt like a fever dream of glass and obsidian. The penthouse was a sprawling sanctuary of cold luxury, perched so high that the clouds seemed to drift past the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was a space designed for a man who looked down on the world, not one who lived within it. But as Layla's eyes adjusted to the dim, amber-lit interior, she saw the details she had missed in the sterile environment of the office. On the mahogany sideboard sat a collection of ancient daggers, their blades shimmering with a wicked light. In the corner, a wall of monitors displayed flickering security feeds from across the city, ports, warehouses, and alleyways Layla had never seen on any corporate map. "This isn't just a home, is it?" Layla whispered, her voice echoing in the vast, open space. She turned to find Jae-hoon watching her, his coat discarded, the sleeves of his white shirt rolled up to reveal the powerful muscles of his forearms. "The office is where I manage the legitimate interests of the Kang Group," Jae-hoon said, walking toward her with that slow, predatory grace. "This is where I manage the reality that makes those interests possible. You've spent 5 years looking at the ledgers, Layla. Now you're looking at the ink." He gestured to the window. Below them, the city was a grid of flickering lights, beautiful and chaotic. Out there, people think the law keeps them safe. In here, we know the truth. Balance is kept by those with the strength to hold the scales. My men, Han and Jung, they aren't just bodyguards. They are the extensions of my will. Layla walked to the glass, her reflection ghost-like in her bridal lace. For years, she had been the gatekeeper to this man's schedule, thinking she knew his every secret. She had handled his private phone calls and organized his discreet meetings, but she realized now she had only been seeing the polished surface of a deep, dark ocean. The chairman wasn't just a titan of industry, he was the law of the shadows. "Are you afraid?" he asked, his voice right behind her. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat radiating from him, a silent, mounting pressure. Layla looked at her reflection, then at his. The dragon tattoo on his neck seemed to coil in the low light, a mark of a life lived in blood and loyalty. She thought of Malcolm, whose power came from a bank account and a name, and then she looked at Jae-hoon, whose power was etched into his very skin. "No," she said, her voice surprising her with its steadiness. "I spent 5 years wondering why the most powerful men in this country bowed to you before they ever saw your balance sheet. Now I understand." Jae-hoon stepped closer, his hand coming to rest on the glass beside her head, effectively pinning her between the city and his chest. "Most people run when they see the dragon, Layla. They want the protection, but they can't stomach the price." "I've never been most people, Chairman," she replied, turning to face him. The proximity was intoxicating, a mix of terror and a strange, new thrill. "You didn't marry a secretary today. You married the woman who kept your world running while you were in the trenches. I'm not going anywhere." A ghost of a smile touched Jae-hoon's lips, the first real emotion she had seen since the altar. It wasn't the smile of a boss. It was the look of a man who had finally found a partner who could look into the sun without blinking. "Good," he murmured, his gaze dropping to the ink on his neck before returning to her eyes. "Because in this house there are no secrets, only loyalty, and from tonight my enemies are your enemies. My world is your sanctuary, but it is also your cage if you ever betray that trust." As he walked away to answer a glowing red phone on his desk, Layla realized the contract she had signed in the car was far more binding than she had imagined. She wasn't just his wife. She was the consort to a king of the underworld, and as the guards outside the door shifted into a new formation, she knew her life as Layla N. Wankwo had truly ended. The sanctuary was beautiful, but it was built on a foundation of steel and secrets, and she was now the keeper of them all. The heavy silence of the penthouse was broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner of the chairman's private study. Jae-hoon had been called away to the docks for an urgent discrepancy in a shipment, leaving Layla alone with the ghost of her former life as his secretary. Habit was a difficult thing to break. Even in her silk lounging robes, Layla found herself straightening the edge of his mahogany desk, her fingers tracing the familiar grain of the wood where she had placed his coffee every morning for 5 years. The study was a room she had entered 1,000 times, yet today it felt different, sacred and heavy with the weight of the man who owned it. She moved toward the back wall, where a shelf of leather-bound ledgers sat slightly askew. As she reached up to align them, her sleeve caught on a hidden latch behind the molding. With a soft click, a narrow, concealed drawer slid open at the base of the desk. Layla froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She shouldn't look. The dragon did not forgive trespassers, even those who shared his bed. But the drawer didn't contain weapons or ledgers of blood money. Inside lay a single, weathered manila folder, unmarked and worn at the edges. With trembling hands, she opened it. Her breath hitched. Inside was a collection of photographs, but they weren't the surveillance shots she expected of his enemies. They were of her. The first was a grainy, candid shot taken 5 years ago. It was her first day at the Kang Group. She was standing in the lobby, looking small and overwhelmed, clutching a cheap briefcase and wearing a suit that was 2 sizes too big. In the photo, she was smiling at a security guard, unaware that she was being watched. As she flipped through the stack, the realization hit her like a physical blow. There was a photo of her eating lunch alone in the park 3 years ago, a look of quiet determination on her face. There was a candid shot of her asleep at her desk during the grueling merger of 2024, a blanket draped over her shoulders that she had always assumed a cleaning lady had left behind. At the bottom of the pile lay a small, handwritten note on the back of a company memo. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was unmistakably Jae-hoon's, sharp, precise, and commanding. It was dated the week she started. "She is the only light in this gray building. I will wait until she is ready to see the sun." Layla sank into his oversized leather chair, the photos scattered across her lap. She had spent 5 years believing she was invisible to him, a mere tool in his vast empire. She had convinced herself that his occasional lingering gazes were just him waiting for a report, and that his protective nature was merely about preserving a high-value asset. She had been so focused on Malcolm's loud, shallow promises that she hadn't seen the quiet, burning devotion of the man standing right beside her. He hadn't married her at the altar just to save her from embarrassment. He hadn't stepped in because he needed a wife for his image. He had stepped in because he had been waiting 5 years for an opening, waiting for the moment she would finally be free of the man who didn't deserve her. The sound of the elevator chiming in the hallway made her jump. She scrambled to put the photos back, but her hands were shaking too hard. The heavy double doors of the study swung open, and Jae-hoon stepped in, the scent of rain and gunpowder clinging to his black overcoat. He stopped when he saw her sitting in his chair, the folder open on the desk. His eyes, usually so unreadable, flickered with a rare flash of vulnerability before settling into a hard, focused stare. He didn't move. The silence between them stretched, thick and charged.